All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're tackling a concept that's super important for understanding how the world works, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant and international relations is on your radar.
Absolutely.
We're talking about multipolarity.
Yeah.
So this is the idea that global power is shifting. It's moving away from just one big player calling all the shots and spreading out to several major players.
And the really interesting thing is this isn't just some theory in a textbook.
Right.
It's happening right now, like
Yeah.
all around us. And from the stuff you sent me, it seems the experts are pretty divided on whether all this is going to make the world more peaceful or
Yeah.
kind of send things in a less stable direction.
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. Right? We're looking at the same thing, this shift towards multipolarity.
Yeah.
But we've got two totally different takes on what it means. You've got one side saying it's a recipe for disaster, and then you've got the other side saying, hey, this could be a chance for a more balanced world where everyone cooperates.
Yeah, and some of the strongest arguments against multipolarity, the ones saying it's going to be a bad thing, they come from a school of thought called neorealism. Basically, neorealists, they see the world as this constant power struggle. Countries are out for themselves, trying to survive. And historically, they say those times when you've got a bunch of powerful countries all vying for the top spot, well, those tend to be the times when things get messy.
Right, because if you've got all these powerful countries, they're all going to be suspicious of each other.
Right, exactly.
Nobody trusts anyone. Everybody's trying to figure out what the other guy's going to do, who's making deals with who, and then everyone starts scrambling to build up their armies just in case.
Yeah.
To protect themselves.
And there's actually a term for that whole dynamic. It's called the security dilemma. Basically, it means that when one country tries to make itself safer, it can actually end up making everyone else feel less safe. So they all start beefing up their defenses, and it just creates this spiral of suspicion and tension. And, well, history's got some pretty clear examples of how that can go wrong. I mean, think about what led up to World War I.
Oh, yeah.
You had all these powerful empires in Europe, all competing, all forming and breaking alliances and just stockpiling weapons like crazy.
Yeah, that didn't end well.
No, it did not. And I'm guessing the folks who are worried about multipolarity see some parallels there. Like they see some similarities between what's happening today and that pre-World War I era.
Oh, definitely. So are they saying that we're basically headed for another world war? What are the specific things that have people so worried?
Well, the big one, the one everyone's talking about, is the rivalry between the U.S. and China. The U.S. has been the top dog for decades, but China's been growing so fast, both economically and militarily. And that shift in power is making a lot of people nervous. Because, history shows us these kinds of power transitions rarely happen peacefully.
That's true. I mean, even just looking back over the last 100 years, there are tons of examples of rising powers trying to challenge the existing order. And yeah, things usually end up in conflict. So where do we see that playing out between the U.S. and China? What are the real points of friction?
Well, there are a few big ones. Taiwan's a huge one. China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province that needs to be brought back into the fold. But the U.S. has said they'll defend Taiwan if China tries to use force. Then you've got the issue of Tibet. China's been criticized a lot, especially by the U.S., for their human rights record there. And then, of course, you can't forget about the competition for resources. China needs a lot of energy and raw materials, and they're going after them in places like Africa and the Middle East, which puts them right up against U.S. interests.
And it's not just about, who controls what land or resources. Right. There's this underlying tension, too, because the U.S. is a democracy, and China, well, not so much. Some people say that clash of values, that difference in how they're run, makes conflict almost inevitable.
Right. Yeah, that's what the clash of civilizations theory is all about. It says the big conflicts in the 21st century, they're going to be driven by these deep cultural and ideological differences. It's a pretty grim outlook.
Yeah. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to what's already a really complicated situation. But before we get too carried away with all the doom and gloom, we should probably point out that not everyone agrees with this whole multipolarity equals disaster idea, right?
Oh, you're totally right. There's a whole other group of people who are actually pretty optimistic about this whole thing. They say, yeah, new powers are rising, and maybe the U.S. isn't the only superpower anymore, but that doesn't have to mean war. They think this shift could actually be a good thing. It could lead to more cooperation and a more balanced distribution of power globally.
Okay, so paint me a picture of that. What does a more optimistic version of multipolarity look like? What's their vision?
Well, instead of seeing China and these other rising powers as a threat, they say the U.S. should see it as a chance to kind of share the burden a little. Instead of trying to do everything themselves, the U.S. could let other countries step up and take on more responsibility for things like global security and the economy. It's about moving away from that America First attitude and being more collaborative.
So instead of clinging to that superpower status, the U.S. would be proactively trying to integrate these new players into the system. But wouldn't some people say that's a bit naive? Like, what's to stop these rising powers from just trying to overturn the whole system and take over themselves?
And that's where those terms we talked about earlier, balancing and bandwagoning, become really important to understand how countries act in a world with multiple power centers. Let me explain.
Hold on. Before we jump into that, let's take a second to recap what we've covered so far.
Good idea.
So we started by explaining what multipolarity is, this shift in global power. And then we looked at two very different ways of seeing it. We've got the pessimists,
Yeah.
and they're looking at history, they're thinking about things like the security dilemma, and they're painting a pretty bleak picture. They're worried about rising tensions, especially between the U.S. and China, and they think it could lead to conflict.
And for anyone listening who's studying for the UPSC exams, this whole debate is super important to understand. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about really understanding the forces that shape international relations and being able to analyze different points of view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've laid the groundwork for understanding the pessimistic view of multipolarity. And when we come back, we'll dive into the optimistic side and unpack those key concepts of balancing and bandwagoning. So don't go anywhere. And hey, while you're waiting, why not hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the rest of this deep dive?
Okay, so let's get back to those terms you mentioned, balancing and bandwagoning.
Right. I gotta say, they sound more like something you'd hear in a sports commentary than in a discussion about international relations.
Haha. Yeah, they do sound a bit out of place. But they're actually super important for understanding how countries act when you've got several big powers on the scene. So balancing, that's basically the classic underdog strategy.
Oh.
It's when weaker countries team up to counter a more powerful one. They form alliances to make sure that no one country gets too strong and starts pushing everyone around.
So it's like kind of like that old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
all about collective security, making sure that power is spread out so that no one gets too dominant and throws their weight around.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about bandwagoning? How's that different?
So bandwagoning, that's when countries actually decide to side with the powerful country.
Really?
Yeah. Instead of ganging up to oppose it, they join it, hoping to get some benefits.
So it's kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them.
Haha, exactly. It's more about taking advantage of the situation than being afraid. Countries might bandwagon for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they want better trade deals, maybe they're looking for protection, or maybe they just want to have a say in how things are run.
So how does this all tie back to the whole optimistic view of multipolarity?
Well, the optimists say that instead of trying to fight the rise of these new powers, the U.S. should try to encourage them to bandwagon.
Oh, interesting.
The idea is if you can get countries like China and India to work within the existing system, it might actually make things more stable in the long run.
So it's like a keep your friends close and your enemies closer kind of thing. But wouldn't that be a huge change for the U.S.? I mean, they've been used to calling all the shots for so long.
It would definitely be a shift, but it's not like there's no precedent for it.
Yeah.
Think about what the U.S. did after World War II with Japan and Germany. Yeah. Instead of punishing them, the U.S. helped them rebuild, helped them become part of the global system. And it worked out pretty well. Japan and Germany became strong U.S. allies and helped keep things stable.
So the optimists are saying if the U.S. can do that again with China and other rising powers, maybe this multipolar world wouldn't be so bad.
Yeah, that's the hope. And there are some things that make that scenario seem possible. One is the fact that countries' economies are so interconnected these days.
Right.
Like, take the U.S. and China. They do a ton of trade with each other. Their economies are completely intertwined. So it wouldn't make sense for them to start a war. It would hurt both of them.
Yeah, no one wants to shoot themselves in the foot, right?
Exactly. And on top of that, you've got a shift happening in U.S. foreign policy. They're moving away from that go-it-alone approach and putting more emphasis on working with other countries and international institutions.
So less America first and more like let's work together.
Exactly. And some people see that as a good sign that the U.S. is willing to share power and cooperate, which could make this whole transition to a multipolar world smoother.
Okay, so after hearing all of this, both the pessimistic view and the optimistic one, it sounds like the big question is whether these new powers will decide to challenge the U.S. or work with them?
Yeah, it all comes down to that, and there's no easy answer. There are so many factors that could influence that decision. The personalities of the leaders, what's going on in their own countries, how the global economy is doing, even cultural and ideological stuff.
Right. So we can't just say multipolarity automatically means peace or multipolarity automatically means war. It's way more complicated than that.
For sure.
But even so, knowing about these ideas, the security dilemma, balancing, bandwagoning, how economies are connected, the changes in U.S. policy,
Right.
that gives us a framework, like a way to understand what's happening in the world today.
Absolutely. It's like having a new set of lenses to see things more clearly. And for anyone studying for the UPSC, these concepts are crucial. You need to be able to explain them, understand how they apply in the real world, and use them to analyze what's going on.
Absolutely. So we've looked at both sides of the multipolarity debate, the good and the bad. We've talked about balancing and bandwagoning. But now comes the really big question. Which vision of the future do we find more convincing? Are we on a path to conflict, or is there a chance for a more peaceful and cooperative world? We'll be right back to tackle that question and wrap up our deep dive into multipolarity. Welcome back. So we've spent all this time talking about multipolarity, the good, the bad, all the different ways things could go. What are you thinking? Which side of the argument are you leaning toward?
It's tough. I mean, history kind of tells us that these multipolar systems don't always end well. They can lead to all sorts of chaos and conflict. But then again, you think about how connected everyone is economically these days, and maybe that'll help keep things in check. And if the U.S. can handle this transition smoothly, use diplomacy to keep things stable, maybe the future isn't as bleak as some people think.
Yeah, it really feels like we're at a crossroads. Like the path we choose now will have a huge impact on the whole world. And there's no easy answer, no way to predict exactly how things will play out. It depends on so many things, the leaders, the global economy, random events.
And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating, right? We're talking about forces that are shaping all of our lives, the future of the planet. And for anyone studying for the UPSC exams, this kind of deep understanding of global issues is exactly what you need. It's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about analyzing, thinking critically, understanding different perspectives.
Absolutely. You need to know those terms, security dilemma, bandwagoning, all that. But you also need to be able to apply them. Like, how do they play out in real situations? What are the different countries thinking? How might their actions impact the world?
Exactly. And I think one of the most important takeaways from all of this is that the future isn't set in stone. It's not like we're just doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. The choices we make individually and as a global community, they matter. They can actually change the course of history.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into multipolarity, I think the biggest question we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of future do we want to build? Do we give in to fear and anxiety because things are changing? Or do we see this as a chance for a fresh start, a chance to work together to build a world that's more cooperative, more equitable, and ultimately more peaceful?
Those are the big questions for sure. And there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. We'll have to figure it out together. But the important thing is to have these conversations, to challenge our own assumptions, to keep searching for a better way forward.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive, found it thought-provoking, and maybe even a little inspiring. Remember, the world is complicated and constantly changing, but by understanding the forces at play, we can all become more informed citizens, more critical thinkers, and more active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
Exactly. And if you're prepping for the UPSC exams, we hope this discussion helped you grasp some key concepts in international relations. Keep learning, keep exploring, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
And as always, if you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share with your friends. Until next time, keep diving deep.